Leopold II, King of Belgium from 1865 to 1909, and unlike most monarchs of the 19th century, someone who is still continuously mentioned today in various public debates. During his reign, he partook in the scramble for Africa at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, where he managed to lay claim of an enormous area of land on the African continent, which Leopold II named the Congo Free State. Consequently, he became its founder and sole owner, and he abused his ownership to violently force the indigenous people into labor for his own economic gain. The treatment of the Congolese people was driven by a sense of racial hierarchy, and the exploitation of the Congo resulted in widespread atrocities such as massacres and the destruction of communities. Because of this, Leopold II acquired the infamous status of a brutally racist king, who still today is practically regarded as the embodiment of colonial violence. In 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement, which peaked at that time, had highlighted the need to confront colonial histories and its lasting effects of systemic racism. The movement has also spurred global conversations about the removal of monuments to figures like Leopold II, whose actions have contributed to a legacy of racial violence and oppression. In Belgian cities like Brussels, Ghent, and Ostend, protests have called for the removal of statues of Leopold II, symbolizing the push to reckon with this painful chapter of history and its continued impact today. One of the most common forms of protest against statues of Leopold II was to smear them with red paint or spray them with red graffiti. Now, the novice on the subject of Leopold II may pose certain questions about why the color red was used consistently in these actions of protest. In order to answer this, it is useful to properly analyze what the color red is and what it means. Red, as is every color, is in itself a pure quality. It exists in itself, which means it is not related to anything else, and it is an abstract possibility. We can experience a color only when it is incorporated in an existent thing, but it is nevertheless distinct from its embodiment. In other words, we can extract the quality from the material stimulus and contemplate the pure qualities they bring in themselves. In concrete terms, a color in itself is a monad, but as soon as a quality is perceived, its potentiality changes to something existent. Now, picture yourself walking on a promenade in Ostend, Belgium, and you see the statue of Leopold II with red paint on it. As a sign, it forces itself upon you, and it will probably lead to the existent thought within your mind, namely, why is this statue painted red? This example illustrates the fact that the situation shifted from a monadic towards a dyadic relationship, namely the confrontation between the sign and your mind. To answer the question, it is useful to contemplate about what the connotation of this specific color is. In other words, you will have to understand the convention or law about the color red that exists in society. Now, red in itself is in our society often interpreted as an aggressive color. It suggests blood, fire, and danger. It also symbolizes violence, revolution, power, and love. Note here that the context is important because there are a lot of connecting connotations that are connected with this color. Besides this insight, you will also have to understand the relationship between the color and what is depicted in the statue. When one is introduced to the figure of Leopold II and places the color red in this context, it becomes clear that red symbolizes the bloodshed and violence that he caused. The connection of all these different aspects forms a triadic relationship. Now, I made the previous short analysis according to the semiotic theory of Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce was a 19th century American philosopher, logician, mathematician, and semiotician. And he developed his theory of semiotics as a form of logic, as a philosophy of representation. The foundation of the semiotic theory of Peirce are three categories, which represent Peirce's way of referring to what can be present to the mind. These are respectively named firstness, secondness, and thirdness, and they provide us with a logical way to describe reality and our experience. The categories can be applied to every kind of phenomena in our reality, and they describe and explain everything that we can possibly experience. Now, Let's make these three fundamental categories a bit more clear. I will start with the first category, namely firstness. Peirce describes firstness as a quality or feeling. It is being with no relation to anything else. Classic examples of firstness are colors, smells, sounds, and feelings that we have. All of these can be described as pure possibility or pure potentiality, because the possibility that this phenomenon becomes object of our thought is inherent to firstness. We can say that every phenomenon that becomes object of our thought possesses a quality that allows this. It is important to note that this possibility can be embodied in something. For example, a color is a possibility that can be embodied in different objects, such as a piece of clothing, a flower, or in this case in paint that is smeared upon a statue. In this embodiment we find the characterizations of secondness. Peirce describes secondness as being in relation to another, brute force of reality, something that occurs and that we perceive and that enters our consciousness. Whereas firstness is pure potentiality or possibility, secondness is pure factuality and existence. It is, so to say, real. Secondness is the concretization of firstness. It is a reaction to the pure possibility of firstness by making this concrete in the form of a concept. The final fundamental category is thirdness. Peirce describes thirdness as a description of the relations that are necessary to make the objects in its secondness meaningful. Thirdness is pure generality, habit, convention, law, mediation, and continuity. If we apply this to the previous analysis, we know that the general idea in society is connected with Leopold II is to condemn him for his cruelties and immediately link him with racism and colonialism. The convention or habit is that the red paint symbols the bloodshed and violence Leopold II caused, hence the statues are smeared with red paint. An important remark to make about these categories is that they are never separated. At first sight it may seem, in the way the examples were given, that the categories stand on their own. But if you think a bit further, you will notice that every kind of phenomenon, experience, and reality is always a combination of the three categories, and that they are always interwoven with one another. In concrete terms, the object has a quality which makes it possible, that is firstness, monadic, that a perceptual judgment of that object, that is secondness, dyadic, can be brought into a representative connection with other objects, that is thirdness, triadic. So you can see in the current example that the paint has a quality, namely red, which makes it possible that a perceptual judgment of this can be brought into a representative connection with the statue of Leopold II and the convention in society about how we think about this figure. As with most historical figures, the perception people have about Leopold II has changed throughout history. To explain this, it is useful to take a look at the three modes of being that Peirce formulated. Peirce calls the first mode of being simply being, and this falls under the category of firstness. Being is a possibility of being or existing, in which the possibility or potentiality clearly showcases that being is firstness. For example, fictive characters in books, movies, and theaters and such have the possibility of being, but they don't really exist and have never existed. The second mode of being falls under the category of secondness and is called existence. Existence is a factual or real being or existing in which the factuality clearly showcases that existence is secondness. For a historical figure like Leopold II, we can say that he factually existed. It is a fact that this man lived from 1835 until 1909. Moving on to the last mode of being, which Peirce calls reality, and which logically falls under the category of thirdness. A reality is, so to say, a cultural convention, and it includes all the ways in which we portray the figure of Leopold II in our society. So, to make a distinction between existence and reality, the man Leopold II factually existed, that is, existence. But there have been so many demonstrations held protesting against his legacy, there have been so many books written about him, videos have been made about him, debates held about him, and so on. which makes it the perception we have of him today is no longer a historical fact, but rather a culturally determined convention, that is, a reality. Now, an important remark is that the process of giving meaning to something or someone is never ending. We can safely say that the general idea that we have in society today about Leopold II differs from that of 50 years ago, and probably from the idea society will have about him 50 years from now. With this remark, it becomes clear that a perception or interpretation is never final, because the process of semiosis is never ending. Now, I just said that semiosis is a never-ending process, but the novice on the subject will probably wonder now, what is semiosis? Well, this is in essence described as sign action, which includes the production of meaning. But before you can fully understand what semiosis is, or what sign action is, it is fundamental to first understand what a sign is. Peirce has formulated countless definitions of a sign, but in general he applied a broad concept of a sign. This broad conceptualization states that a sign is anything that can have meaning. Note also that knowledge can only be acquired through semiosis, because it is impossible to communicate meaning or content. We as humans can only communicate with certain signs, and hope that through semiosis, another party will acquire the knowledge that we are trying to communicate. To further understand what a sign is, it is interesting to look at the semiotic triangle you see on your screen right now, because this contains all aspects of a sign. There are, of course, as always in Peirce's theories, three aspects which all fall under one of the three fundamental categories. The first aspect of a sign is a representamen, which falls under the category of firstness. A representamen is a material aspect of the sign, for example a sound, an image, or a written character. For example, if I write the words Leopold II on a piece of paper, then the written characters that form these words are the representamen. The representamen is in itself a monad. The second aspect of a sign is the object, which falls under the category of secondness. The object is that to which the representamen refers. It more or less motivates the sign. In this we find the dyadic relationship that is inherent to secondness. In the example, the words Leopold II on a piece of paper refer to the man who was the second king of Belgium, that is the existent Leopold II. Now the last aspect of a sign is the interpretant, which falls under the category of thirdness. The interpretant is that which is produced in the mind of the sign recipient. Now a common mistake that people often make is that they think the interpretant is the one who interprets, that interpretant is a synonym of interpreter. But this is in fact not true. Interpretant is not the one who interprets, but it's that which the use of the sign leads to in the mind of the sign recipient, perhaps best described as interpretation. The interpretant is a form of synthesis. It is a mental connection between the representamen and the object, which showcases a triadic relationship that is inherent to thirdness. This interpretant often follows a habit, convention, or generally accepted interpretation of a certain sign, which again showcases thirdness. In the example, if I show the piece of paper with the words Leopold II onto someone else, that person will probably not only think about the man Leopold II in itself, but also associate this with the cruelties that took place in the Congo because of him. Now, a first remark that is useful to make is that Peirce distinguishes two sorts of objects in his theory, namely the immediate and the real or dynamical object. The immediate object is described as the object as represented in the sign that gives a sort of hint to the object. Important to note with the immediate object is that the reality is represented by the sign, by the conceptual concept of the sign. What Peirce means with real or dynamical object will become more clear with the following explanation. Now, a sign cannot express an object directly. It can only indicate and leave the interpreter to find out what the specific object is by collateral experience, that is, prior knowledge of or prior experience with the object. The term dynamical expresses that the real object always escapes the objective interpretation, because this reality can only be known, understood, and communicated on the basis of signs that take its place. A second remark that is useful to make is that semiosis is a never-ending process. One might think that the semiotic process ends with the interpretant, but this is not the case. The interpretant is not the end, but forms only a moment in the whole process. The interpretant itself can be understood as a sign, which in turn would be a starting point for a new step of interpretation or reasoning. This would schematically result in an infinite field of semiotic triangles, and this process or phenomenon in itself is called unlimited semiosis. From this remark follows the insight that the process of meaning-making never stops, which I already discussed by explaining how the general idea in society about Leopold II today differs from that in the past and from that in the future. Now we shall take a look at how Peirce distinguishes three principal ways in which the sign can represent its object. Peirce states that a sign should be analyzed according to how it is connected with the thing that it represents. The first manner in how the sign can represent its object is called an icon, and the viewer will by now understand that this falls under the category of firstness. An iconic sign represents its object by a relationship of similarity or resemblance, a sort of imitation, so to say. The sign resembles that to which it refers, and the relationship is one of mimesis. Because of the quality that is inherent to this relationship, the sign could represent a part of reality. Whether this possibility is realized depends on the subject. As an example, I will use this picture, in which we can see an iconic representation of King Leopold II. It is iconic because the bust resembles the person Leopold II. The second manner in how a sign can represent its object is called an index, which falls under the category of secondness. An indexical sign is physically connected with the object, it remarks it, and there is a form of contiguity of the reality of that to which the sign refers. The relation is one of material or causal connection between a sign and the object. It points at existence. A remark to be made is that the interpretation of a sign as an index is a result of a learning process. One gets to know images mainly through experience. In this picture, we can say that the statue in itself is an index for the greatness of the king because of the way in which he is represented, that is, as a heroic man. To give a perhaps banal but maybe more simple example, in the top left corner of this picture we find a waving flag. And this is an index for the fact that it was windy at the time the picture was taken. Now, the third and final manner in which a sign can represent its object is called a symbol, which falls under the category of thirdness. A symbolic sign is connected with the object by virtue of the idea of the symbol, which is some kind of convention or habit in society. The conventional symbolic signs are based on an agreement or law. The connection between a sign and the denoted reality is established by and for a community of sign users. The relation between the sign and the object is, so to say, conventional. It is a habit to connect the sign with the object. Now, symbols are abstract signs because outside of the convention they are utterly meaningless. A perfect example of symbols are therefore words. Every word is a symbol, because there is no similarity or causal connection between the word and the object it represents. Every language has its own specific agreements about how certain words refer to a referent, and learning a language is about making these specific agreements your own. An example concerning Leopold II can be given by referring to this photograph, where words like BLM, which is an acronym for Black Lives Matter, and F racism are graffitied on the statue. They are symbolic because for someone who isn't familiar with these language conventions, these signs are meaningless. For example, someone who isn't familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement won't understand what BLM means, what it represents, and why it is relevant in the context of Leopold II. Now we are going to take a little detour from Peirce's theory and focus a bit more on images. As a start, it is important to know what an image is and what its characteristics are. An image poses the absent present by showing it, and it differs from other signs in that it is based on some form of analogy with the represented object. Now, one can say that an image represents, presents, and communicates. That is, it represents something based on analogy by a form of iconic resemblance. It also presents what is absent. It refers to an absent object and makes it present. It also communicates, that is, it evokes a meaning in someone, because an image is just like other forms of signs aimed at communication. It addresses a receiver or observer with a certain intention, that is. Now, in the picture you see on the slide right now, one can say that the statue of Leopold II represents Leopold II sitting on a horse, and by doing so, it presents the absent figure of Leopold II and makes him in a way present, and it also communicates something about him. That is, by showing him sitting on a horse wearing some kind of military outfit, the statue communicates the idea that Leopold II was a heroic and great king. Now, the following two remarks are important to better understand the concept image. Firstly, it is significant to note that an image has two important characteristics, namely causality, in that it appeals to a causal history and the producer's intention, and similarity or resemblance. Now, these characteristics will become more clear with the following possible definition of an image. So we can say that I is an image of O when there is some kind of analogy between I and O, and when this relationship of analogy between I and O is based on causality. The aspect of causality here means that the producer of the image had to be motivated by a certain object to produce the image. Returning to the example of the statue, we can clearly see that it shows an analogy with King Leopold II sitting on a horse, and that the producer was motivated by the object, that is, the man Leopold II, to make this statue. As a second remark, it is important to note that a representation does not show by indicating the object itself, but by substituting another object for it, something that resembles it to a greater or lesser extent, or that is supposed to exhibit some degree of resemblance or analogy with the proposed object. With this remark in mind, we can say that the observation that visual representations are based on likeness, that this must be qualified from the outset. After all, images do not simply evoke the object they represent, but always do this in a specific way that depends on the coding used or current mode of representation, and the point from which the object is viewed, namely the point of view. Note, for example, the differences in point of view and mode of representation in the following depictions of Leopold II you see on the screen right now, and note specifically the different messages that are conveyed by these different representations. Now that we went a bit further into the concept image, we can integrate the semiotic theory of Peirce in our understanding of images. Firstly, we can apply the semiotic triangle specifically to images, and by doing so we get a clearer view on the three basic aspects of the image. First, there is the material thing-like aspect, which is also sometimes called substance, as representamen. Second, there is the object that is depicted by the image. Note here that we can make the distinction between the direct object, which is the depicted object, and the dynamical object, which is the object that is evoked by the image. Lastly, there is the way in which the object is depicted, the representation form, as the interpretant. Furthermore, we find in an image the three levels that Peirce connects with every use of signs. Firstly, an image has pronounced iconic aspects in the sense that it shows necessary similarities or analogies with the depicted object. An image is an icon in that it is a representation. It is a sign that takes the place of the object. Secondly, an image indicates. It has an indexical function which mainly concerns making the object present. Indicating is based on the relationship between what is showed and the way in which it is showed. An image is indexical in that it is a representation. It is a reference to the object. Lastly, an image is symbolic in that it is a form of communication or announcement. It shows something to someone. During this video, we have looked at Peirce's semiotic theory and at the concept image. With the previous slide, I already briefly applied Peirce's theory on images, but now we are going to do one final exercise on this synthesis by specifically analyzing the statue of Leopold II in Ostend you see on your screen. This exercise will briefly summarize what I tried to explain during this video and will hopefully clarify the theory of Peirce even further. As a starting point, it is useful to ask ourselves the question, why was this statue made in this specific way and placed in this specific place? Now we can try to answer this question by analyzing the statue by means of Peirce's semiotic theory. The statue in itself, the material image that is given, is the representamen. Now we can also distinguish two objects according to Peirce. The direct object, that is, in this case, a man on a horse who is surrounded by other people, and the man turns out to be Leopold II. The dynamical object, however, is Leopold II, the strong, heroic king who is worshipped by the people. We find that because the representation form underlines the greatness of Leopold II and how he's worshipped by his servants, the interpretant of this statue is that we have to honor this great king. Furthermore, it is useful to point out that the central position of the king in the statue, but also between the two arches, and the fact that he is placed upon a horse and much higher than his servants, are all well considered aspects to showcase his power. And indeed, because the statue was made and placed in this specific place to honor Leopold II as benefactor of Ostend, he is portrayed as an honorable and powerful being. Also, we can see that the statue has iconic aspects because it shows analogies with Leopold II, with a horse, with humans as servants, and so on. It also has indexical aspects because it makes Leopold II present in a way and indicates his greatness. It is also a symbol because it communicates something about the depicted figure to the spectators. In the photograph you see on your screen right now, we can see how the statue was vandalized as an action of disagreement with this representation of Leopold II as a heroic king. The color red, as we saw earlier, is in itself a pure quality, a pure firstness. However, the red paint smeared upon the statue is indexical for the violent and inhumane actions of Leopold II in the Congo, because the color red is also a symbol in our society for bloodshed and aggression. When you would pass the statue smeared in red paint, it opens up a new dynamical object, namely the cruel King Leopold II, who isn't heroic at all. The interpretant that follows might be the thought, should we even have statues of such a cruel man? Now, these new types of interpretants each contribute to a new habit or convention in society about how we should think about Leopold II. I would like to end this video with some final remarks on the subject of the vandalization of the statues of Leopold II as well as on the theory of Peirce. Concerning the debate about Leopold II, we can say that these types of vandalization showcase a new public opinion in society and a disagreement with the old ways of thinking about colonialism and racism. The question is if this is a good or a bad thing. Some might argue that vandalization should never be glorified, but on the other hand, because of these types of protest actions, it makes that attention in society is focused on these specific topics. Also, these types of protests may provoke new dynamical objects and interpretants, which can eventually change convention in society about how to think about certain topics. Another question that is often posed in this debate is about whether the statues of Leopold II should be removed or whether they should be cleaned and remain where they are. Another idea that is sometimes proposed and that I find quite interesting is that we should not clean them and should either leave the vandalized statue where it is or put it in a museum in its vandalized state. From a semiotic point of view, this might be a powerful message that showcases how society today thinks about colonialism, and it furthermore showcases the process of continuous semiosis. Now, to end this video, I would like to make two brief concluding remarks on the semiotic theory of Charles Sanders Peirce. First, it is interesting to note that this theory helps us to not only analyze language signs, but also visual signs such as images, statues, and so on, that we are constantly surrounded by every day. Furthermore, Peirce gives us relevant categorizations for understanding and describing reality. Second, it is important to say that Peirce's theory is much broader than what I try to explain in this video. My goal was to give the novice on the subject a brief introduction on the theory and to show its relevance in understanding certain topics in society today. I really hope you've enjoyed this video and that I was able to give you a first introduction to Peirce's theory. Furthermore, by using it in order to further understand a contemporarily relevant phenomenon, that is the protests against the colonial legacy that still impacts our society today, I hope that I showcased the relevance of Peirce's theory in understanding all kinds of phenomena we encounter. Thank you for watching.